Hi, this is Gershon Wolf and welcome to Modern Music Composition. So we're going to continue our discussion here on the fourth species counterpoint, and today we're going to talk about the suspension. In the previous video I talked about the tie and how the tie operates. Here the tie is operating as a suspension. And so I've got two examples here. One is here and the other one is right here. So just to go over this real quickly, what this is we've got our chord here, and in this case we have a G7. We have a dominant chord, and now I've written our suspended note in red. And so what you can think of this actually as, here's your miniature cantus firmus, and here is what you're going to be writing the counterpoint for. So this is in 2/4 time. That means I have 2 quarter notes for every measure. So here's my 2 quarter notes, or I can have a half note, okay? And so my cantus firmus is a half note. It plays a half note in the duration of that measure as I'm putting down 2 quarter notes. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, you can clearly see that this D is part of the G7 chord, right? G, B, D, and then F, okay? Well, what happens when D gets suspended over to the next measure? And why am I even calling it a suspension right now? What is a suspension? Okay, well, so I've written down here that this tied note, okay, let's do a couple definitions here. The first D is called the tying note. When it gets suspended over to the next measure, it's tied. So you're in the process of tying, and at the end, it's now tied. That's a good way of looking at it. So what is this note doing here, this D? Well, this D is not part of this C major chord, okay? What's it doing there? Well, I'll tell you what it's doing. It's disrupting the melody and the rhythm, okay? That's what we want in fourth species counterpoint. That's our syncopation, okay? We want that suspension. We want this note not to belong to this C major chord, because now it's going to want to resolve. It's almost like you've taken a spring in its upright position and you've bent it over, and where does it want to go when you let go? Well, it's gonna go back to its original position. It's back of its position of least, minimize its energy. So what do we use as a definition for suspension? Well, the suspension, it holds the correct harmonic tone in suspense. That's why it's called a suspension, because it's holding what is the correct harmonic tone in suspense, okay? This C is obviously part of the C major chord. It's just, and you're waiting to hear that. When you play something like this and then you resolve it down to a C, you'll know exactly what I mean, because that's where it wants to go, okay? Well, so just to complete this first example, which is a good example, D suspends the real chord tone C. Okay, that's what D is doing. It's suspending this real chord tone C until it resolves. Okay? Well, you can do the opposite. And here, I've got our G7th chord, but instead of writing a D now, C is our suspended tone. But in this case, it's not called a suspension, it's called an anticipation. Okay? Why is it called an anticipation? Okay? Well, C clearly does not belong to G7. Okay? So this is anticipating where it thinks it needs to go. Well, it obviously belongs to C major, so it's anticipating that there's going to be a C major chord that it's going to fit into. okay, into this next beat. And here E is also part of the C major chord. This is actually done quite a bit to a certain effect, but frankly speaking, it's quite disappointing, and it really doesn't work very well. So I would call this example good. This example, not so good. When we talk about suspensions, we want to talk about this example right here, where essentially this time note belongs to the cantus firmus part of that measure, and as it gets suspended over, it does not belong to the new cantus firmus, whether it be a single note or a chord, it doesn't matter. But then it's going to be resolved into a note that does belong to this. Simply stated, this note is dissonant to this chord. This note is consonant to this chord, and that's going to be important in our next video when I talk about and continue to talk about fourth species counterpoint, because it's so important here, okay? Well, I've written down a couple of chord progressions. In fact, let's write another one. Let's write the 1, 6, 4, 5. That's a very popular pop progression, the 1, 6, 4, 5. The 1, 5, 6, 4 is also popular, but the 1, 6, 4, 5 is very popular. And where does that 5 want to go? Where does that, and why is it that you'll see all the time, and people talk about this all the time, when you're resolving your dominant chord back to the tonic chord, you want to use a 7th to do it? Well, there's reasons for that. Counterpoint has a lot to do with it. Whether you know it or you don't, it does. Anyways, back to this example, the 2, 5, 1, that's the de facto jazz standard chord progression. The 1, 4, 5, 1, well, that's been used for centuries now. And now you can start to see how important counterpoint really is, because it's, like I said, it can be masked because you may not need to know exactly what's going on to just know that you have to go and use this type of progression. Well, this is very, very helpful in composing music, and a critical tool, actually, in how your music is composed. In fact, I'll give you a quick example here in terms of atonality. Okay, like I said, counterpoint is all a tonal structure. There's actually what's called, I don't want you to get confused, there's actually what's called atonal counterpoint, okay? But if you ever look it up, all that really is taking the rules of counterpoint and inverting them. I don't suggest doing that. That's just my personal opinion, but and I think others feel the same way too. But that's not really what you want to do with counterpoint in terms of speaking atonality. So here's a cool thing. Remember I mentioned that spring. Well, you could think of dimensionality. I've got not necessarily a spring. I might have a rigid bar where when I stretch it, I create dissonance, and when it comes back, it only comes back on one plane. Okay, in a two-dimensional plane. What if it was some type of spring that when I torqued it and let go, it's going to be doing this. Not just this, but it's going to be doing this, coming back, sampling many spots in three-dimensional space back to its low energy state. Back to it, low energy state meaning back to its consonant state. Okay. When it samples all those different points, think of the chromatic scale. Think of each one of those different points is a chromatic note outside of the diatonic scale. So what I'm saying here is one way to compose atonal music and keep it kind of quasi-tonal or quasi-atonal, however you want to think about it. And that's how I like to think about atonal music, is it still gets resolved. It just kind of goes outside the bounds a little bit further. And it's up to the composer how far it goes out and the quality of the sound and then getting back and resolving back. That's really important. So think about counterpoint, think about tonality, and then think about how you can take an atonal structure using counterpoint to create a piece of music. Because you know now how counterpoint is used in these progressions. And I think that's very valuable, okay, to understand how it creates a tension and then wants to resolve. Okay, and that creates this energy that we talked about in the previous video, and how we want to kind of disrupt the melody and the rhythm so we can get sort of a sense of motion forward. Well, if you understand the underlying nature of this counterpoint, and in particular the 4-species counterpoint, it's going to be very, very helpful to your compositions. Anyways, that's it for today, and I'll see you later.